Hello everyone. Clicker. Ah, good as gold. So to start up, I'd first like to acknowledge the Bigidjal and the Gadidjal peoples, the traditional owners of the land that we've all come to gather on today. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. This is the title of my presentation, Bitcoin is Private Property. My name is Kai. I go by the name Yippee Beans, and I'm just your ordinary everyday Bitcoin pleb. In my prior fiat mining life, I worked in government for over 2.5 decades in policy, regulation and legislation making. And I acquired some expertise in the area of competing and conflicting property rights. And so today I'd like to share some concepts about property that aren't commonly well understood by people in government as well. This presentation then leads to an explanation of how Bitcoin and its existence in the digital realm interfaces with the system. Now, by the system, I mean the entrenched societal gain rules that are put in place. One, through the powers of Parliament that set the rules. Two, they're interpreted and enforced through the executive government. And three, they are arbitrated by the powers of the judiciary. So we have three separate branches with three separate sets of powers. These powers are vested through the Crown and ultimately through the Sovereign, which is King Charles III. As matters currently stand, regulators all over the world are fumbling to get their heads around what Bitcoin is. Now I'm going to do my best mid-wit mode here. It's a security! No, wait, it's a commodity, it's money transmission, but it's not currency. We approve a Bitcoin ETF, but we don't approve Bitcoin, not the Twitter hack approval, but the official real approval. So, adjacent to all that noise and all that battle for public narrative, the judicial branch of the system is quietly seeing case law evolve in high courts all across the world. England, New Zealand, Singapore, as well as the District Court of Shanghai. And they are all arriving at a consistent legal interpretation that Bitcoin is property and therefore subject to well-established property laws. Now, case law by nature is very slow to evolve, especially when you compare it with the pace of technology. However, the judiciary is required to be objective and consider facts. Hence, the courts, although slow in process, usually get things right at the end of the day, including the fact that Craig Wright is not Satoshi. So let's dive into some of the fundamental legal concepts behind property rights. This is a photo of a sign inside of an ice cream shop. If you lick an ice cream inside an ice cream shop, does that make the ice cream yours? So there's one argument of thought that it's not your ice cream until there's been a formal transfer of ownership, i.e. through an exchange of money with the vendor. A contrary argument is that for all practical purposes, an ice cream, once licked, becomes ice cream belonging to you. Because it is a lot less likely to become subject of a competing claim of ownership. You'd all be familiar with the expression that possession is 9/10 of the law. What that expression means is that it is easier to maintain possession of something. It is Yeah, what that means is that ownership of property is easier to maintain if you have possession, and likewise, if you're not in possession, it is harder to enforce. A seagull verbally claiming that a piece of food is mine does not confer property ownerships of that piece of food, because other seagulls may also wish to contest ownership and may also claim mine. The seagull who is able to obtain and maintain possession of that food is the owner of bearer-held tangible property. The legal concept of ownership flows from possession. Now we're going to move on to the concept of land and structures on freehold land, because freehold is traditionally thought to be the highest form of absolute ownership that anyone could possibly achieve. So if you are a freehold owner of land in Australia, how do you go about proving that you're the owner of the land? Well, in Australia, since British settlement, there have roughly been two systems of land administration. There's one system, we'll call it the old system, and the other system is the Torrens title system. Now, in the old system, they used paper-based title deeds, which are long-established legal instruments of ownership. If you wanted to sell your land under the old system, you had to possess an unbroken original paper trail of a chain of title deeds with all of the information of all the previous owners and all the previous transfers of ownership of that parcel of land right back to the Genesis block of land. So in Australia's case, the first grant of land post-British settlement. The Torrens title system replaced the old system in the 1850s and is still the system that we have in place today. It's essentially a centralised database, a register, that is overseen by a registrar, which is a dude with powers. If your name is listed on the registry as the owner of a parcel of land, your claim to that property is considered indefeasible. Indefeasible means that it is unable to be challenged through the legal system. This is what gives the Torrens title system security and trust. The exercise of quiet enjoyment over one's property or one's freehold land will always remain subject to obligations of the landholder and valid claims from others. A freehold property will typically coexist with controlled airspace above the land, state-owned mineral rights below the land, and public water rights running across the land. In the system, the term property does not refer to a thing. Rather, it refers to one's legal relationship with a thing and the degree of power that one can legally and pragmatically exercise over the thing. Let me share a story with you to illustrate this. In the early 70s, there was a dude named Koike. He was employed as a gardener at James Cook University in Townsville. Now, legend had it that Koike would stand in the campus gardens and listen to law lectures through the garden windows. Koike, whose whitefellow name was Eddie, thought that he owned his property on Mare Island that was passed down to him through his ancestors, through Torres Strait Islander traditional law and customs. To his dismay, he learnt that his homeland was legally considered property of the Crown, the British sovereign. Koike formed relationships with library staff and academic staff at the university, and eventually, over 2 decades later, this became the subject of a watershed High Court case known as the Mabo case in 1992. Few aspects about the Mabo case that aren't directly relevant, but I do have to mention it and then put it aside. The first matter that we need to put aside from the Mabo case is that the British assertion of sovereignty over the Australian continent was considered not valid. Awkward. Because the British relied on the concept of terra nullius, that is, that it was land belonging to nobody, and that was their basis for acquisition of territory. Also got to put aside that the court stopped short of making a ruling about that non-valid bit, because the court asserted that the matter was indefeasible, meaning unable to be challenged through the legal system, because the High Court's powers itself are vested in the Crown. And putting aside that this unresolved matter of competing claims of sovereignty over the Australian continent continues to leave a gap of uncertainty at the core of Australian society. Australia today remains the only developed Western nation in the world not to have some sort of treaty or settlement with its Indigenous inhabitants. So putting all those threads aside, what the Mabo court case told us in case law was that both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander societies exist and have existed and continue to exist, and that these societies actually operate complex traditional knowledge systems that govern intergenerational property rights through traditional law, LORE law, which is law that is passed down, as opposed to LAW law, which is law that is imposed by authorities. Property is often referred to in white man's law as something that belongs to someone. But in Australian Aboriginal society, connection to country is deeply significant for the physical and spiritual well-being of all Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people speak of themselves not as owners of the land, but rather as belonging to the land, as custodians for future generations. The human rights that applied to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander societies got labelled by Australian legislatures as native title. The bundle of native title rights varies from group to group, but will typically include the right to exist, the right to be present, the right to camp, the right to hunt and gather, the right to conduct traditional ceremony, and the right to protect places of cultural significance. Now, an important side note is that in exercising these native title rights, one still must carry them out in a manner that is not inconsistent with the system of law, and in a manner that does not impede the enjoyment of other people with other valid rights and interests over the same area of land. The system of property rights as governed by traditional law, LORE, is recognised in case law to both exist and now coexist with the system. The Mabo decision crystallised that another property ownership paradigm exists, where issuance, governance, and transfer of property rights are not validated by instruments of the state, but rather an alternative complex system of property rights that existed prior to British settlement. Today, we have another alternative system of property ownership governance that both exists and coexists with the system. Bitcoin is private property in the digital realm. The Bitcoin network provides for private property rights where issuance and governance come from the use of proof of works and consensus mechanisms. The transfer of property ownership is authorised through mathematics and cryptographic proof. The possessor of a Bitcoin key, of a Bitcoin private key, is the owner of the Bitcoin. Each Bitcoin transaction signifies the transfer of property from one owner, the bearer of the private key, to a new owner, the new bearer of a new private key. The bearer of a Bitcoin private key indicates through the, broadcasting a transaction that they are mathematically the owner of the property. The intention to transfer ownership of a specific UXTO, or chunk of Bitcoin as I like to say, is publicly announced through the owner's wallet via a broadcast to the Bitcoin network. Participants within the Bitcoin network can then cross-check that transaction, make sure it all checks out, make sure there's no double spending. And then transactions which are deemed valid by the network consensus rules are immortalised forever into Bitcoin's tamper-proof public ledger. Only the holder of a Bitcoin private key is able to prove irrefutably the possession of a scarce, well-defined piece of digital property. With Bitcoin, property owners do not require legal names, contracts, identification documents, handwritten signatures for proof of ownership, but rather Bitcoin ownership is enforced via cryptographic proof. Ones and zeros, literally informational energy, which can be represented as 24 words inside of your head, which is the same as the freedom of thought and the right to freedom of speech, and the same as the right to enjoyment of your private property. Bitcoin ownership is the expression of human rights that is bestowed upon every person and cannot be tangibly seized or confiscated by others. Long-established concepts flow from the fact that Bitcoin is private property. I probably won't go into all of them because I can see the time. There's a whole host of new concepts that come out from applying property law to Bitcoin, such as divorce settlements, trusts, insolvency of exchanges. But one of the most significant things is that under the system of law, Bitcoin is not currency, because a currency is a fiat token that is decreed by government to be the legal tender in which to pay one's state debts and taxes, i.e. the AUD. So Bitcoin certainly exists monetary-like properties, and some opt to use it as a preferred monetary system, and that's okay. But under the system, under the legal system, Bitcoin is not currency. No more so than candy in a schoolyard or cigarettes in a prison. And that's okay too. The Bitcoin network exists in the digital realm, and it coexists with the system through established property rights laws. Bitcoin shifts the paradigm of how we perceive ownership of private property from something that is physically held, secured by traditional legal documents, and transferred via institutional services, to now something that is held in the digital realm, secured by cryptography and transferred peer-to-peer. After 15 years of existence, Bitcoin, the digital asset, has emerged as scarce private property. Its fiat price is derived from its absolute mathematical scarcity and its supply, which is capped at 21 million. Bitcoin does not care about your race, your age, your gender, your wealth, the country you were born in, your job title, the certificates you hold, your social status, or who you know. Bitcoin changes the game rules. Bitcoin is an emergent internet native asset that provides productive capital for all of humanity. Thank you.